Hey there, welcome into the Unpaid Interns podcast, Monday afternoon, and man, things could not be more exciting right now in the world of IU sports. Right now, that starts with the Indiana women's basketball team. The Hoosiers knocked off the number one overall seed in their region, NC State, on Saturday in the Sweet 16, and they advanced to their first ever Elite Eight in program history. We have a great guest to talk all about Terry Morin and her team's success. Will Trubshaw has covered IU women's basketball the last 2 years, this year for IUSTV. Will, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Griffin. I'm really excited. What a fun time to be talking about IU women's basketball,
huh? The best season, I think, no doubt, in this program's history. Now, they, as I mentioned, knock off NC State, a pretty thrilling end to that game, 73-70. What was your just reaction overall to what might have been the biggest win ever in IU women's basketball history?
Well, I mean, I think it's just a sign of how far this program's come under Terry Morin, and even this year. I mean, there was a point early in the game, IU was down 11. At the end of the first quarter, I believe the score was 22-14, and NC State was shooting like 60%. Earlier this year, or even last year, I don't know how well this team would have responded to that kind of punch being thrown, but they come out in the second quarter and they outscore them 20-11. And take a lead into halftime. It's such a talented team, and they're so good defensively. It was just from start to finish, you're holding your breath the whole time. It's like, man, what's going to happen here? Especially at the end when Mackenzie Holmes fouled out. That was the biggest danger point for me, because IU would run up a 14-point lead in the second half, but then you knew NC State was going to make a run at the end of the game, but especially when Mackenzie Holmes went out. But I mean, IU continues to hold their ground. I think that's what's made this such a special season, is that they very rarely have folded. The pressure hasn't gotten to them all that much this year. I mean, it's just impressive. I think it's the sign of a senior-laden team, but a team that they know what it takes to win.
You mentioned that second quarter, they come in down 11, and you're maybe thinking things are going to get away from them. They're the underdog facing the number one overall seed. But they dominated the Wolfpack. Both the second quarter took a 1-point lead to halftime, and then IU, just stifled NC State, especially defensively, as you said, but also offensively. They scored 44 points in 20 minutes, and saw the stat today. They shot 60% from the field in the second and third quarters. That's an NC State team, top 20 in the country on defense, and kind of known for their Wolfpack defense. We haven't maybe thought of this program as an offensive team. What kind of did you see in those second and third quarters that they were able to just, they were hitting shots from everywhere?
Well, that's one of the beauties of this defense that Terry Morin has created at IU, is that they are very much predicated on not only getting out and playing tight lockdown defense, but they get out on the run too in transition. If you go back and look, a lot of those points were scored in transition and stuff. That's where this team makes their money, because they're not really a good three-point shooting team. They knocked down a couple, and the three-point shooting has been helped a little bit by Nicole Cardano-Hilliard. But overall, this is just not a team that steps outside and drains shots, much like NC State did to start the game, or a team like a Maryland or an Iowa can with some of their players. That's not really IU's strength. Their strength is getting out in transition, and when that happens, I mean, it's kind of game over for teams, because they wear them out defensively, and they kind of just exhaust them running up and down the floor. They turn it into a track meet, and that it very much benefits IU in that sense. Terry Morin always, and the players always credit strength and conditioning coach Kevin Konopasek just for getting him in tremendous shape. And I think it really shows. They really wear teams down to a nub. I mean, you look at it too, in the first half, they forced 11 turnovers for this NC State team that, like you mentioned, Griffin, they're a remarkably efficient team defensively and offensively. They're a team in some ways to kind of mirror IU. They don't turn the ball over a lot. They generally force other teams to turn it over. But IU completely, they look like the number one seed from the second quarter on in that game. They looked just like a team that they've done it so many times before. And we know that's not necessarily the case, because this is the first Sweet 16, first Elite Eight for this team.
I want to touch a little bit more on the offense, and what
Mhm.
struck me as well, looking at the box score, was the balance. And I think, especially in this era of college women's basketball, you don't see it very often. There's typically one go-to player, and what we'll talk about Arizona, their opponent tonight, who very much has that one go-to player, scores the bulk of their points. IU had all five starters score in double digits. Where have you seen this come from, and how important, I guess, is it to this team's style, Will?
Well, it's huge. I think a lot of it does start with just the addition of Nicole Cardano-Hillary to that starting lineup, because she kind of plays the one, and then it allows Ali Patberg to shift over to the two. And, again, take a look at the box score. Ali Patberg was the leading scorer in that game against NC State, 17 points. When Ali Patberg is scoring, it opens up a whole nother dimension for this IU team, because you're going to get your points from Mackenzie Holmes and Grace Berger. But once you get Ali Patberg involved, that's huge. Again, Nicole Cardano-Hillary has just shown such a propensity to be a pest on defense, and she's one of those players that really capitalizes on the turnover. I want to say she forced like 4 or 5 of them herself, either like actually getting in there and stealing the ball, or she just gets in the passing lane and deflects off someone, and it's an IU ball. But Alexa Golbe too. She's one player that she has the capability. I think she could easily score 15 to 20 points a game if she wanted to. But the thing is, IU doesn't always need her to. But like in a game like this, they needed her to step up, and you saw she asserted herself on the glass, and offensive and defensively. And I mean, she found ways to cut to the basket and lay it in. So I mean, I think this team has always had the potential to be a very well balanced team on offense. It's just a matter of, do they execute? But I mean, when they can get out on the run, and when they are in the flow of their game, anyone can score at will with this offense.
I think you mentioned Nicole Cardano-Hillary 2 or 3 times, and he got the post-game interview on ESPN after the game. And I think it was in part, as much as she had success offense, and I think came in to IU transferring from George Mason, people were talking about her three-point shooting. She had 14 points. But you mentioned it, 4 steals for her in that game, especially in that third quarter run. And she's been kind of the lockdown defender. And I just find it an interesting story, and I kind of want your insight, just because I know you've watched all their games all season. I remember her first game was against Tennessee at Assembly Hall, the day before the NCAA had announced all transfers were eligible. She was eligible to play from George Mason, and she just looked lost on the court. A 3-ball, airballing 3 balls, not connecting on defense, and obviously, you're going to expect some transition, but where she's gone from there to suddenly being the X factor, it seems like, on this team. I mean, how has she developed it and fit in like this?
Well, I mean, she was the all-time leading scorer at George Mason. It's not like she was a freshman coming into this team. It's not like say another player who just got cleared for waivers for IU is Paige Price, who a freshman coming in a semester early from Australia. It's a different scenario. Nicole Cardano-Hillary has played Division I college basketball for a few years now, so she knows what it takes. I think it was just a matter of getting into the flow of things, because you can practice as much as you want with a team, but practice is just a completely different scenario than actual games. And especially when you get thrown in against Tennessee, who came into this NCAA tournament as a 3 seed. I mean, that is a really, really solid basketball team. It's a tough way to get thrown in the fire. But I'm not that surprised that Nicole Cardano-Hillary adjusted as well as she has, just because, I mean, she's been through it before. She was the star on another team. She's a point guard. Point guards, they are generally the most intelligent player on the basketball court. They have to know where everything's going. So she's a smart kid as it is. She's going to pick it up pretty quickly. So really, I don't know, to me, it's not that surprising at all. I think it was welcome for IU, especially when you had Jalen Penn and Danielle Patterson opt out, because then, I mean, you need someone to step up. So was there a little pressure too to get jump started a little faster? I'm sure there was, ultimately, when all those chips fell into place. But I mean, if there's anyone who is well suited to do it, I think it's going to be Nicole Cardano-Hillary, just because of the resume she had coming in to IU.
I want to go a little big picture here and was watching the NC State game on Saturday. A lot of it reminded me of when they played Kentucky early in the season. It was kind of their first non-conference test. Both teams went undefeated, and Kentucky's a team I think was a 4 seed in the tournament. IU looked great. I mean, early in that game, I think especially the second quarter, got out to a big lead, double-digit lead in the fourth quarter, and then things started falling apart for them against the Wildcats and ended up losing that game. And it kind of looked like things might happen the same way as you touched on against the Wolfpack. It was a 13-point lead early. Mackenzie Holmes fouls out, and NC State had some opportunities down the stretch. And we'd kind of seen these collapses or just inabilities to finish in tight games. You think about the Maryland one as well. The Hoosiers couldn't complete the comeback. What was the difference? And how much was that a mental barrier for IU to kind of get over these last couple months where they've been in games, they've shown they can even dominate teams for maybe a quarter, but not finish the game?
Right. Well, I mean, again, I go back to kind of what I said at the beginning of the show here was that, I mean, this team has come such a long way just from this season. I mean, you can think back to last year too. There was a stretch after they started out that season so red hot, beating South Carolina, playing so well. But then kind of in the middle of the season in Big Ten season, they lost to like Maryland and Northwestern and Ohio State, bang, 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 3 games in a row. And it was all similar scenarios to that where they blew what were late leads, or they struggled later in the games. They seemed like they ran out of gas. And so again, I credit it to 2 things. Again, this is something I'm sure the team would tell you is that their conditioning is elite. Like they are, just from a physical standpoint, they're a top tier. They can hang with anyone for 40 minutes just from an endurance standpoint. But as well, I do think there's a big mental aspect to it. You had a couple games, like you mentioned, the Kentucky and the Maryland game this year, where they had that late lead. They were hanging tough for most of the game, and then it got away late. And, to me, that's always one of those inflection points. Like, what happens to us now? Is this going to be a repeat of last year, where we just keep fizzling out late to teams, or are we going to change the script? And they changed the script. And again, I credit that a lot to it being a veteran team. I mean, you look at the leaders on this team. You have Allie Patberg, a senior, Nicole Cardano-Hillary, a senior technically. You've got Alexa Golbe, who's been around forever. Kiana Worthen's been around forever. Grace Berger's a junior now. These players, they've been through the ringer now a couple of times, and I think that they understand what it takes to win. And with that said, they were able to overcome those challenges. They learned and they adapted too. And I think, you credit just the team for learning and growing. I think it's just a classic case of, as time goes on, they get better. Like a fine wine, they've kind of aged, and it's paying dividends now in crunch time in the tournament.
It's exciting to see a team develop over the course of the season. We've certainly seen that this year, and it's paid off. And it's paid off in the history books as well. I was just poking around and know that Indiana had never made even the Sweet 16 before. It once made it to the final 16, but it was a round shorter. First time in the Elite Eight or in winning 3 games in the NCAA tournament. Now they did go to a Final Four in the IAW, which was the precursor to women's sports being in the NCAA. They lost to Immaculata University. So, it was a different time. And on the premise of that, was Saturday's victory the biggest win? I said, is it the biggest win in IU women's basketball history? And what does it kind of do for the program going forward, no matter what happens in this next week?
Yeah, I think unequivocally, this is, every win has been the biggest win. When they advanced to the Sweet 16, I think you would call that the biggest win in program history, because it was their first Sweet 16 in the current modern era format. Now they advanced to their first Elite Eight. And it was, again, it showed just their mental fortitude and stuff and how far this team has come. Again, another sign of, this being the biggest game this team's ever had. But I think, going forward, whatever happens this Monday evening against Arizona, win or lose, this season, the last, I would say 3 seasons, really have put IU on the map on a national level. I really think teams are aware that this team is for real, and I don't think you can say it's a fluke either. I mean, I think Terry Morin has built something here that is is sustainable. It's going to last a long time. And, this is certainly a run that opens eyes to teams. You don't want to call it a Cinderella because they're a 4 seed. 4 seeds are still really good teams. Had this been a normal year, IU would have played its first 2 games at Assembly Hall, right? I mean, they had a remarkable season to begin with, but I don't know that anyone would have expected them to get this far. But the progress that the program has made and Terry Moore, and it's going to last a while. I think this is like the first sign of it. This is like the first bud on a tree in spring blooming. This is the sign that they've arrived, and they're going to be here for a long, long, long time.
As we are seeing the first buds of spring literally blooming on the trees. I was walking around Bloomington and saw a little bit of that today. But one more kind of big picture question before we get into the nitty gritty of tonight's big Elite Eight matchup against Arizona. We were kind of talking about it. This team's improved over the course of this season, but there was one blip in the radar. They've won 12 of their last 13, but that one loss kind of came out of nowhere. Quarterfinal loss in the Big Ten tournament to Michigan State. IU came in as a 2 seed, thought maybe they could win their first Big Ten or their second ever Big Ten tournament, and got really dominated in the second half of that game. How much I know Terry Morin's talked about this a little bit. I mean, how much do you feel that might have been a wake-up call for this team and it's kind of led to their success now in the NCAA tournament in Texas?
I think it's huge. I mean, there's no doubt, Michigan State always plays Indiana tough. Even the one time they met in the regular season, it was a 79-67 win for Indiana, so a 12-point win. But nonetheless, they've been played pretty close to the chest there with the Spartans. So that said, I mean, of course, it's a wake-up call. I think this team, I don't want to say they got complacent, but I mean, you win 10 games in a row and you feel like we can conquer the world. And, sometimes you almost need that wake-up call because if you beat Michigan State, you're on that roll. Maybe you run into a wake-up call against a VCU or, a VCU at halftime of the round of 64 game, it was 22-17. If you don't have the wake-up call against Michigan State, maybe you run into some trouble there with VCU. You get a little, I don't want to say overconfident because I don't think this team is always very level-headed too. I think that's one of their other big advantages. But I think it was a much-needed reset. I think it was a good, hey, let's reevaluate where we are. This wasn't it would have been a nice prize, but I think, there's a bigger prize to be won in the NCAA tournament. So it's a good way to reset, recharge the batteries a little bit, and go in the NCAA tournament feeling confident. And I think that's exactly what we've seen. It's a team that it was a scared straight kind of moment, but I think it's paying dividends so far.
So, Will, tonight is the next step for Indiana as they try to continue this March Madness run. Mentioned they're going to take on Arizona, the 3 seed. They just took down Texas A&M on Saturday night, who was then the highest seeded region. Its highest seeded team in the Mercado region still left was the 2 seed. 9 p.m. Eastern primetime on ESPN. We'll get into some of the specifics, including kind of the obvious IU-Arizona connection. But what kind of just stands out overall for you about this big matchup?
Well, you know what? In a lot of ways, these two teams are very similar. Both pride themselves on the defensive end first, and as a result, they get a lot of their offense out of defense too. They're a very athletic team, this Arizona team, and we'll talk about it a little bit, I'm sure. But R.A. McDonald can just fill it up. I mean, she is an absolute walking bucket. She has terrorized every team that Arizona's faced so far in this tournament. So it'll be interesting to see how IU deals with her. Of course, IU has dealt with a player of her caliber in Caitlin Clark at Iowa this season, who dropped 30-plus points in both games, and IU won both games. So I think, IU certainly knows how to handle themselves against a high-scoring team. But I'll be honest, I kind of envision this as kind of a low-scoring game. I think we're going to see some really gritty defense, and it's going to come down to 1 or 2 possessions at the end of the game. This is not going to be a cakewalk for either team. I don't really envision a double-digit win one way or the other. I think both these teams are going to be scrapping it out to the end. But yeah, this is it's an Arizona team that a few years ago they were kind of a moribund program. IU before Terry Morin came in, kind of a moribund program. Neither of these teams were had a straight direction. In a few short years, their coaches have absolutely turned it around, and look at where they are. They're battling for a chance at the Final Four. So it's going to be a lot of fun tonight. I can say that much. Like, this is going to be two teams that they want it bad.
Yeah, a lot on the line for both programs, for two teams that are normally not in the Elite Eight. And you mentioned Aari McDonald, and I wanted to touch on her a little bit more. I mean, a laundry list of accolades over the last couple of years, back-to-back Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year. She won the Ann Drysdale Award last year for best shooting guard in the country. Will probably win that again. Likely going to be a Naismith finalist this year, and she was already named Pac-12 Player of the Year. And against Texas A&M, 31 points. No one else on Arizona was even in double digits in that game, and they won pretty comfortably. You mentioned it. IU was able to defeat Iowa twice, but Caitlin Clark did score a lot. A similar player, a guard that can kind of score from all levels. How do you expect that IU is going to guard McDonald tonight?
Well, I think I expect Nicole Cardano-Hillary, for one, to get the primary assignment on her. She's going to wear her out. Might draw some foul trouble, but again, that's a problem that happened in some of those Iowa games. IU's had to deal with foul trouble before, and it's always kind of next lady up, right? It's not there's no excuse making with this team. So I imagine that we'll probably see a lot of Nicole Cardano-Hillary on Aari McDonald, and if they can't really slow her down from outside, again, I think they're really going to clamp down on the other offensive options. On that side of the ball, because again, that's what worked in those Iowa games. But you go back and you look at the final scores in that. The first time IU and Iowa played in Iowa City back in February, 85-72 win. Then you go to March 3rd at Assembly Hall, it was an 89-80 win. So the other thing IU can do too is they can outscore teams. Obviously, again, Arizona, they did a good job of limiting Texas A&M on the offensive side, and then they allowed Aari McDonald to cook, and then they didn't really need anyone else to score on the offensive end. But IU, again, like we've talked about, they have enough playmakers on offense that they can outscore Arizona. And if you can turn it into a track meet, that really favors IU. Whatever other, as similar as these two teams are, I really do think IU just has the superior conditioning. They have the upper hand if it becomes back and forth, up and down the floor. And when IU does that, they can put up 80, 90 points in a game. They don't need to score that all the time because their defense is so good. But I very much can see a scenario where if the game is kind of trending like the Texas A&M was in terms of offensive output for Arizona, IU might be able to just turn it up a notch and outpace them.
That'll certainly be interesting to watch. One thing you mentioned is the foul trouble. And if you go back to that Michigan State loss, their only loss since early February, I believe, last 13 games. They've only lost in the last 13 games. That was a big factor. And the one other thing that this team doesn't have is a lot of depth. I mean, you look at their starters, all 5 starters played at least 33 minutes. And all of them, except for Mackenzie Holmes, played over 36, and that's because Holmes fouled out. And we saw Indiana's defense especially was not the same with Keandra Brown on the floor as it was with Holmes on the floor. Now the other thing with the depth, and I was talking about this with Stefan Krajnik, who also covers the team for the Indy Star. This is, now their team's 4th game in 8 days. They're playing IU's playing their starters over 30 minutes. Both conditioning and foul trouble. I guess how much are those concerns for Indiana? And is there someone that can potentially come off the bench to get more minutes in this game? Because Terry Morton hasn't so far done that in the tournament.
Yeah, well, that is the one thing. Terry Morton, towards the end of the season, I would say actually pretty liberal about going to the bench. You saw Kiana Worthen come off the bench a lot. You got Hannah Navarowski coming off the bench a lot. Keandra Brown, who she would have played a lot more this year. She's been dealing with the hip issues all year. And Terry Morton has said as much. She is not, we know she's not where she wants to be at. We know she's not where she's capable of being because of the hip injuries, but she's still going out there and playing. She had a pretty big bucket too, coming in for Mackenzie Holmes after she fouled out in the NC State game. Drove to the basket and took an Ali Patberg feed for a layup to give IU the 70-63 lead. That was crucial at the time, actually, for winning that game. Honestly, it would have not. You could argue that was maybe the biggest bucket IU had down the stretch. But they are. I do think they're going to need to lean on the bench a little bit more. When you get to the tournament, it always does kind of come down to how good are your starters. That's the thing. It's nice to have the bench depth, but at the same time, you got to be willing to lean on a couple bench players. And I think it's going to be the faces that we've seen the most this season. Kiana Worthen's going to come in, and she has done a really nice job off the bench. She doesn't always score. She's not the biggest bucket getter. I think really she's only had one game this year where she had multiple baskets. She finished with 8 points. I forget which game that was, but it was later on in the year. But I mean, you got to rely on her. Keandra Brown, whatever minutes you can squeeze out of her with that hip injury, keep an eye on her, get her out there. Grace Wagner, who's a defensive first piece. They have pieces that can come off the bench and help supplement the starters if need be. And if there is foul trouble, IU's been good at navigating the foul trouble, but I mean they will have to be a little cautious. This is kind of getting to that danger zone in the tournament where, like you mentioned, there have been a lot of games played in close proximity to each other. It's going to start to wear on these players a little bit after a long season too. 20 plus games in the regular season, so they're going to need help from the bench. But at the same time, I do think you got to trust the conditioning and trust that your players and your starters, they're going to tell you when they're good, when they're not good. And at the same time, I don't think anyone's going to ask out either. I think they're going to leave it all out there on the floor. But I think there are enough secret weapons in the tank that IU can weather a foul storm or just some exhaustion, just for a little bit, not too much though.
Now I mentioned it, we were going to bypass the elephant in the room of this game for a minute, but we'll address it now. Bendu Yaney played at IU for 3 years, started on the 2018 WNIT championship team, tore ACL in the second round of the NCAA tournament in her home state of Oregon, and ended up transferring last year halfway through the year when she wasn't really fully healthy. Kind of saw this draw, I think, at the beginning of the tournament and thought maybe there was a slim possibility the matchup happened. Well, it's actually here. I mean, does this factor that Yaney, knows this IU program is how much, I guess, do you see of that a factor being played tonight? I know both Morin and Yaney have said, we're not thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everyone says they're not thinking about it, but I'm sure somewhere in the back of your mind, especially as a player, I always think it's difficult when you go and face your old team. When the old team faces you, sure, you got the friendships and stuff. But when you're kind of the lone wolf extracted from that old team and you get to face them, especially when the stakes are this high. This isn't like some preseason non-conference game. This is the Elite Eight for a chance to both teams' first ever Final Four. The pressure is going to be high. I'm sure Bendu's thinking about it. And I think, too, at the same time, I think she's got to be excited about it. I mean, she knows this IU team very well. And like you mentioned, she was a key cog for IU for those 3 years that she was here. I mean, you think about, she was a defensive centerpiece. That's why Terry Morin loved her on that team. She was just an absolute terror on the defensive end. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that defense rear its head in this game tonight. I mean, she's going to know who to pick on, and who, what weaknesses are, what strengths each player have, so on down the line. But again, one player can't stop five. Obviously, again, Arizona is a good defensive team all around. But I think it's going to be fun. There's going to be a lot of emotion in this game for sure. I think whoever loses, it's going to feel a little bittersweet. If it's Bendu Yaney in Arizona that end up taking the loss, I'm sure there might be thoughts of what could have been. Well, we're so close, but for IU as well, that would sting to you. See, you're happy for your former teammate. I'm sure if Arizona goes on to win at the same time, it's like, Oh, one way or the other, there are gonna be some strong emotions in this one. But I think when it gets down to it, too, these teams they're just playing to win. They want a chance at the trophy at the hardware. And for a while, it's gonna be sportsmanship for a couple hours, just good old fashioned NCAA basketball. It's when it comes down to it, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yeah, the loser, I mean, the loss is certainly going to sting tonight. It's just interesting a little bit more on Yaney and reading some articles on her and kind of the type of player she was at IU and now is at U of A, where she's starting. She's kind of the exemplar of what Terry Moore in basketball is all about, and a hard-fought defensive player that takes the charges, that gets out in transition after forcing steals, like you says, doesn't necessarily shoot a lot, but just goes out there and plays her heart out, and is kind of, people I've seen tweeting about it, is kind of been the bridge from the, Tyra Buss and Amanda Cahill days for IU to now the Allie Papper, Grace Berger days with the current Hoosiers. But in kind of the irony that in this next step, she's gone, and a program, I think, also with a very similar mantra and philosophy for their program.
Totally. Yeah, it is. I saw actually a thread on Twitter from John Blau, just talking kind of about like that progression of IU basketball under Terry Moore. And yeah, I mean, Bendu Yaney, she was a key cog, and now she faces off against the school that she kind of had a really big hand in helping build this program. You can't argue that. So it's poetic, I think. I don't think you could have drawn it up much better than this, but it's what, I'm looking forward to it. It's T-minus 6.5 hours now until game time. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can tell, Will, you're ready to jump out there on the court and see if you can play as well. I'll get your prediction in a second. I just, one more interesting note I also saw about today's game and the connections between these two teams mentioned with Yaney. IU won the WNIT championship in 2018. Arizona was the team that won that in 2019. So just kind of shows the progression of both of these programs, winning a championship trophy and then gaining some confidence. But I'll leave it at this last question for you, Will, and then I'll let you go and get ready for the game. Give me a key for tonight's game, and then give me a prediction who advances to the Final Four.
Well, here's my key. If it's 65 points, if IU can keep Arizona under 65 points for the game, there's a really good chance they win and move on to the Final Four. And I say that because in the last 41 games that Indiana's held an opponent to 65 points or fewer, they're 41-0. So again, textbook defensive prowess for the Terry Moore team. If you can lock down that offense, if you can even put a lid on Ari McDonald, I mean, this team is just they have enough pieces that it's just you can't overcome that defense. So I think that's the key. And my prediction for a final score tonight, it's going to be close. I think IU wins this one 65-59 in regulation. No overtime. I think it's 65-59 in regulation.
I don't know if Hoosier and Wildcat fans would be able to handle an overtime for their health and their health of their hearts for what's going to be on the line tonight. Do IU students storm I can't talk anymore. Storm Showalter Fountain if the Hoosiers win tonight and steal another fish, or waiting until a potential national title?
I don't know if that's Elite Eight allowed. I think that's more a Final Four. Well, I don't know. If you make the Final Four, that's a pretty big deal. Maybe
someone's cutting down the nets tonight.
Yeah, someone's cutting down nets tonight. I think. Oh man, I don't know. I guess we'll see. I'll tell you what. I'll be staked out there after the game. We'll see what happens, and you'll be the first to know.
All right. If you see the fish getting stolen, you better find where it goes.
If I spot any fish on top of a classroom building, on top of Woodburn Hall, or the media school, I'll we'll be the first ones to report for it, for sure.
Okay, good. Well, should be a fun night tonight. Win or lose, Arizona, Indiana, 9 p.m. Eastern time on ESPN. Will, thanks so much for coming on and breaking down for the IU Sweet 16 victory and getting us all ready for tonight's big game.
My pleasure, man. Looking forward to it. Should be a real good one tonight. This is history one way or the other. It's going to be quite a game.
Absolutely. Make sure to follow Will on Twitter tonight. He'll have updates and his expert analysis from the game at Will Trubs on Twitter. That will do it, though, for today's episode of the Unpaid Interns podcast. As always, if you've missed any of today's podcast or any of our past podcasts, you can check them out on the IU Sports Media YouTube or Twitter page. If you prefer to listen as well, you can get them wherever you get your podcasts, including on Sprecher. We'll be back on Wednesday with another episode at noon Eastern. Trisha Whitaker will be joining me. She's a reporter for Fox Sports South and the Tampa Bay Rays. She'll be helping preview the MLB season. Opening day is on Thursday for baseball. Till then, for Will Trubshaw, I'm Griffin Epstein. Enjoy tonight's game. Have a good one, everyone.